We were engaged in these various tasks until the 24th of January. The atmosphere was clear, the temperature was even, and the thermometer had indeed gone up to 2 or 3 degrees above freezing point. The number of icebergs coming from the northwest was therefore increasing. There were now 100 of them, and a collision with any of these might have a most disastrous result. Hardy, the caulker, hastened first of all to mend the hull. Pegs had to be changed, bits of planking to be replaced, seams to be caulked. We had everything that was necessary for this work, and we might rest assured that it would be performed in the best possible manner. In the midst of the silence of these solitudes, the noise of the hammers striking nails into the side, and the sound of the mallet stuffing tow into the seams, had a startling effect. Seagulls, wild duck, albatross, and petrels flew in a circle round the top of the berg with a shrill screaming, and made a terrible uproar. When I found myself with West and the captain, our conversation naturally turned on our situation and how to get out of it, and upon our chances of pulling through. The mate had good hopes that if no accident occurred the launching would be successfully accomplished. The captain was more reserved on the subject, but at the thought that he would have to renounce all hope of finding the survivors of the Jane, his heart was ready to break. When the Halbrane should again be ready for the sea, and when West should inquire what course he was to steer, would Captain Len Guy dare to reply, to the south? No, for he would not be followed either by the new hands, or by the greater portion of the older members of the crew. To continue our search in this direction, to go beyond the pole, without being certain of reaching the Indian Ocean instead of the Atlantic, would have been rashness of which no navigator would be guilty. If a continent bound the sea on this side, the schooner would run the danger of being crushed by the mass of ice before it could escape the southern winter. Under such circumstances, to attempt to persuade Captain Len Guy to pursue the voyage would only be to court a certain refusal. It could not even be proposed, now that necessity obliged us to return northwards, and not to delay a single day in this portion of the Antarctic regions. At any rate, though I resolved not again to speak of the matter to the captain, I lost no opportunity of sounding the boatswain. Often when he had finished his work, Hurlegerly would come and join me, we would chat, and we would compare our recollections of travel. One day, as we were seated on the summit of the iceberg, gazing fixedly on the deceptive horizon, he exclaimed, "Who could ever have imagined, Mr. Georling, when the Halbrane left Kerguelen, that 6.5 months afterwards she would be stuck on the side of an ice mountain?" "A fact much more to be regretted," I replied, "because only for that accident we should have attained our object, and we should have begun our return journey." "I don't mean to contradict," replied the boatswain, "but you say we should have attained our object. Do you mean by that we should have found our countrymen?" "Perhaps." "I can scarcely believe such would have been the case, Mr. Georling, although this was the principal, and perhaps even the only object of our navigation in the polar seas." "The only one, yes, at the start," I insinuated, "but since the half-breed's revelations about Arthur Pym." "Ah, you are always harking back on that subject, like brave Dirk Peters." "Always, Hurlegerly, and only that a deplorable and unforeseen accident made us run aground." "I leave you to your delusions, Mr. Georling, since you believe you have run aground." "Why is not this the case?" "In any case it is a wonderful running aground," replied the boatswain. "Instead of a good solid bottom, we have run aground in the air." "Then I am right, Hurlegerly, in saying it is an unfortunate adventure." "Unfortunate, truly, but in my opinion we should take warning by it." "What warning?" "That it is not permitted to us to venture so far in these latitudes, and I believe that the Creator forbids his creatures to climb to the summit of the poles. Notwithstanding that the summit of one pole is only 60 miles away from us now." "Granted, Mr. Georling, but these 60 miles are equal to thousands when we have no means of making them. And if the launch of the schooner is not successful, here are we condemned to winter quarters, which the polar bears themselves would hardly relish." I replied only by a shake of my head, which Hurlegerly could not fail to understand. "Do you know, Mr. Georling, of what I think oftenest?" "What do you think of, boatswain?" "Of the Kerguelens, whither we are certainly not traveling. Truly, in a bad season it was cold enough there. There is not much difference between this archipelago and the islands situated on the edge of the Antarctic Sea, but there one is not far from the Cape, and if we want to warm our shins, no iceberg bars the way. whereas here it is the devil to weigh anchor, and one never knows if one shall find a clear course. I repeat it, boatswain. If this last accident had not occurred, everything would have been over by this time, one way or another. We should still have had more than 6 weeks to get out of these southern seas. It is seldom that a ship is so roughly treated as ours has been, and I consider it real bad luck, after our having profited by such fortunate circumstances. These circumstances are all over, Mr. Jeorling, exclaimed Herr eagerly, and I fear indeed. What you also, boatswain, you whom I believe to be so confident. Confidence, Mr. Jeorling, wears out like the ends of one's trousers. What would you have me do? When I compare my lot to old Atkins, installed in his cozy inn, when I think of the green cormorant, of the big parlors downstairs with the little tables round which friends sip whiskey and gin, discussing the news of the day, while the stove makes more noise than the weathercock on the roof. Oh, then the comparison is not in our favor, and in my opinion Mr. Atkins enjoys life better than I do. You shall see them all again, Boatswain Atkins, the green cormorant and Kerguelen. For God's sake do not let yourself grow downhearted. And if you, a sensible and courageous man, despair already, oh, if I were the only one it would not be half so bad as it is. The whole crew does not despair, surely. Yes and no, replied Herr eagerly, for I know some who are not at all satisfied. Has Hearn begun his mischief again? Is he exciting his companions? Not openly at least, Mr. Jeorling, and since I have kept him under my eye I have neither seen nor heard anything. Besides, he knows what awaits him if he budges. I believe I am not mistaken, the sly dog has changed his tactics. But what does not astonish me in him, astonishes me in Martin Holt. What do you mean, boatswain? That they seem to be on good terms with each other. See how Hearn seeks out Martin Holt, talks to him frequently, and Holt does not treat his overtures unfavorably. Martin Holt is not one of those who would listen to Hearn's advice, or follow it if he tried to provoke rebellion amongst the crew. No doubt, Mr. Jeorling. However, I don't fancy seeing them so much together. Hearn is a dangerous and unscrupulous individual, and most likely Martin Holt does not distrust him sufficiently. He is wrong, boatswain. And wait a moment. Do you know what they were talking about the other day when I overheard a few scraps of their conversation? I could not possibly guess until you tell me, Herr eagerly. Well, while they were conversing on the bridge of the Halbrane, I heard them talking about Dirk Peters, and Hearn was saying, "You must not owe a grudge to the half-breed, Master Holt, because he refused to respond to your advances and accept your thanks. If he be only a sort of brute, he possesses plenty of courage, and has showed it in getting you out of a bad corner at the risk of his life. And besides, do not forget that he formed part of the crew of the Grampus, and your brother Ned, if I don't mistake." He said that, boatswain, he spoke of the Grampus. I exclaimed. Yes, of the Grampus. And of Ned Holt. Precisely, Mr. Jeorling. And what answer did Martin Holt make? He replied, I don't even know under what circumstances my unfortunate brother perished. Was it during a revolt on board? Brave man that he was, he would not betray his captain, and perhaps he was massacred. Did Hearn dwell on this, boatswain? Yes, but he added, It is very sad for you, Master Holt. The captain of the Grampus, according to what I have been told, was abandoned, being placed in a small boat with 1 or 2 of his men, and who knows if your brother was not along with him. And what next? Then, Mr. Jeorling, he added, did it never occur to you to ask Dirk Peters to enlighten you on the subject? Yes, once, replied Martin Holt. I questioned the half-breed about it, and never did I see a man so overcome. He replied in so low a voice that I could scarcely understand him, I know not, and he ran away with his face buried in his hands. Was that all you heard of the conversation, boatswain? That was all, Mr. Jeorling, and I thought it so strange that I wished to inform you of it. And what conclusion did you draw from it? Nothing, except that I look upon the sealing master as a scoundrel of the deepest dye, perfectly capable of working in secret for some evil purpose with which he would like to associate Martin Holt. What did Hearn's new attitude mean? Why did he strive to gain Martin Holt, one of the best of the crew, as an ally? Why did he recall the scenes of the Grampus? Did Hearn know more of this matter of Dirk Peters and Ned Holt than the others? This secret of which the half-breed and I believed ourselves to be the sole possessors. The doubt caused me serious uneasiness. However, I took good care not to say anything of it to Dirk Peters. If he had for a moment suspected that Hearn spoke of what happened on board the Grampus, if he had heard that the rascal, as Hurlegerly called him, and not without reason, constantly talked to Martin Holt about his brother, I really do not know what would have happened. In short, whatever the intentions of Hearn might be, it was dreadful to think that our sailing master, on whose fidelity Captain Len Guy ought to be able to count, was in conspiracy with him. The sealing master must have a strong motive for acting in this way. What it was I could not imagine. Although the crew seemed to have abandoned every thought of mutiny, a strict watch was kept, especially on Hearn. Besides, the situation must soon change, at least so far as the schooner was concerned. 2 days afterwards the work was finished. The caulking operations were completed, and also the slide for lowering the vessel to the base of our floating mountain. Just now the upper portion of the ice had been slightly softened, so that this last work did not entail much labor for pickaxe or spade. The course ran obliquely round the west side of the berg, so that the incline should not be too great at any point. With cables properly fixed, the launch, it seemed, might be effected without any mishap. I rather feared lest the melting of the ice should make the gliding less smooth at the lower part of the berg. Needless to say, the cargo, masting, anchors, chains, and sea had not been put on board. The hull was quite heavy enough and not easily moved, so it was necessary to lighten it as much as possible. When the schooner was again in its element, the loading could be effected in a few days. On the afternoon of the 28th, the finishing touches were given. It was necessary to put supports for the sides of the slide in some places where the ice had melted quickly. Then everyone was allowed to rest fro o'clock p.m. The captain had double rations served out to all hands, and well they merited this extra supply of spirits. They had indeed worked hard during the week. I repeat that every sign of mutiny had disappeared. The crew thought of nothing except this great operation of the launching. The Halbrane in the sea would mean departure, it would also mean return. For Dirk Peters and me, it would be the definite abandonment of Arthur Pym. That night the temperature was the highest we had so far experienced. The thermometer registered degrees, 11 degrees 67 letter 2b9c below zero. So, although the sun was nearing the horizon, the ice was melting, and thousands of small streams flowed in every direction. The early birds awoke at 4 o'clock, and I was one of their number. I had scarcely slept, and I fancy that Dirk Peters did not sleep much, haunted as he was by the sad thought of having to turn back. The launch was to take place at 10 o'clock. Taking every possible difficulty into account, and allowing for the minutest precautions, the captain hoped that it would be completed before the close of the day. Everyone believed that by evening the schooner would be at the foot of the berg. Of course we had all to lend a hand to this difficult task. To each man a special duty was assigned. Some were employed to facilitate the sliding with wooden rollers, if necessary, others to moderate the speed of the hull, in case it became too great, by means of hawsers and cables. We breakfasted at 9 o'clock in the tents. Our sailors were perfectly confident, and could not refrain from drinking success to the event, and although this was a little premature, we added our hurrahs to theirs. Success seemed very nearly assured, as the captain and the mate had worked out the matter so carefully and skillfully. At last we were about to leave our encampment and take up our stations. Some of the sailors were there already, when cries of amazement and fear were raised. What a frightful scene, and short as it may have been, what an impression of terror it left on our minds. One of the enormous blocks which formed the bank of the mud-bed, where the Halbrane lay, having become loose owing to the melting of its base, had slipped and was bounding over the others down the incline. In another moment, the schooner, being no longer retained in position, was swinging on this declivity. On board, on deck, in front, there were 2 sailors, Rogers and Gratian. In vain did the unfortunate men try to jump over the bulwarks. They had not time, and they were dragged away in this dreadful fall. Yes, I saw it. I saw the schooner topple over, slide down first on its left side, crush one of the men who delayed too long about jumping to one side, then bound from block to block, and finally fling itself into space. In another moment, the Halbrane, staved in, broken up, with gaping planks and shattered ribs, had sunk, causing a tremendous jet of water to spout up at the foot of the iceberg. Horrified? Yes, indeed, we were horrified when the schooner, carried off as though by an avalanche, had disappeared in the abyss. not a particle of our halbrane remained, not even a wreck. A minute ago she was 100 feet in the air, now she was 500 in the depths of the sea. Yes, we were so stupefied that we were unable to think of the dangers to come. Our amazement was that of people who cannot believe their eyes. Prostration succeeded as a natural consequence. There was not a word spoken. We stood motionless, with our feet rooted to the icy soil. No words could express the horror of our situation. As for West, when the schooner had disappeared in the abyss, I saw big tears fall from his eyes. The halbrane that he loved so much was now an unknown quantity. Yes, our stout-hearted mate wept. The halbrane, staved in, broken up. The halbrane, staved in, broken up. 3 of our men had perished, and in what frightful fashion. I had seen Rogers and Gratian, 2 of our most faithful sailors, stretch out their hands in despair as they were knocked about by the rebounding of the schooner, and finally sink with her. The other man from the Falklands, an American, was crushed in its rush. His shapeless form lay in a pool of blood. 3 new victims within the last 10 days had to be inscribed on the register of those who died during this fatal voyage. Ah, fortune had favored us up to the hour when the halbrane was snatched from her own element, but her hand was now against us. And was not this last the worst blow? Must it not prove the stroke of death? The silence was broken by a tumult of despairing voices, whose despair was justified indeed by this irreparable misfortune. And I am sure that more than one thought it would have been better to have been on the halbrane, as she rebounded off the side of the iceberg. Everything would have been over then, as all was over with Rogers and Gratian. This foolish expedition would thus have come to a conclusion worthy of such rashness and imprudence. At last, the instinct of self-preservation triumphed, and except Hearn, who stood some distance off and affected silence, all the men shouted, "To the boat, to the boat!" These unfortunate fellows were out of their mind. Terror led them astray. They rushed towards the crag where our one boat, which could not hold them all, had been sheltered during the unloading of the schooner. Captain Len Guy and Jem West rushed after them. I joined them immediately, followed by the boatswain. We were armed, and resolved to make use of our arms. We had to prevent these furious men from seizing the boat, which did not belong to a few, but to all. "Hallo, sailors!" cried the captain. "Hallo," repeated West. "Stop there, or we fire on the first who goes a step farther." Both threatened the men with their pistols. The boatswain pointed his gun at them. I held my rifle, ready to fire. It was in vain. The frenzied men heard nothing, would not hear anything, and one of them fell, struck by the mate's bullet, just as he was crossing the last block. He was unable to catch on to the bank with his hands, and slipping on the frozen slope, he disappeared in the abyss. Was this the beginning of a massacre? Would others let themselves be killed at this place? Would the old hands side with the newcomers? At that moment, I remarked that Hardy, Martin Holt, Francis Barry, and Stern hesitated about coming over to our side, while Hearn, still standing motionless at some distance, gave no encouragement to the rebels. However, we could not allow them to become masters of the boat, to bring it down, to embark 10 or 12 men, and to abandon us to our certain fate on this iceberg. They had almost reached the boat, heedless of danger and deaf to threats, when a second report was heard, and one of the sailors fell by a bullet from the boatswain's gun. 1 American, and 1 fugitive less to be numbered amongst the sealing master's partisans. Then in front of the boat a man appeared. It was Dirk Peters, who had climbed the opposite slope. The half-breed put one of his enormous hands on the stern, and with the other made a sign to the furious men to clear off. Dirk Peters being there, we no longer needed our arms, as he alone would suffice to protect the boat. And indeed, as 5 or 6 of the sailors were advancing, he went up to them, caught hold of the nearest by the belt, lifted him up, and sent him flying 10 paces off. The wretched man, not being able to catch hold of anything, would have rebounded into the sea had not Hearn seized him. Owing to the half-breed's intervention, the revolt was instantly quelled. Besides, we were coming up to the boat, and with us those of our men whose hesitation had not lasted long. No matter, the others were still 13 to our 10. Captain Len Guy made his appearance. Anger shone in his eyes, and with him was West, quite unmoved. Words failed the captain for some moments, but his look said what his tongue could not utter. At length, in a terrible voice, he said, I ought to treat you as evildoers, however I will only consider you as madmen. The boat belongs to everybody. It is now our only means of salvation, and you wanted to steal it like cowards. Listen attentively to what I say for the last time. This boat, belonging to the Halbrane, is now the Halbrane herself. I am the captain of it, and let him who disobeys me beware. With these last words, Captain Len Guy looked at Hearn, for whom this warning was expressly meant. The sealing master had not appeared in the last scene, not openly at least, but nobody doubted that he had urged his comrades to make off with the boat, and that he had every intention of doing the same again. "Now to the camp," said the captain, "and you, Dirk Peters, remain here." The half-breed's only reply was to nod his big head and betake himself to his post. The crew returned to the camp without the least hesitation. Some lay down in their sleeping places, others wandered about. Here neither tried to join them nor to go near Martin Holt. Now that the sailors were reduced to idleness, there was nothing to do except to ponder on our critical situation and invent some means of getting out of it. The captain, the mate, and the boatswain formed a council, and I took part in their deliberations. Captain Len Guy began by saying, "We have protected our boat, and we shall continue to protect it." "Until death," declared West. "Who knows," said I, "whether we shall not soon be forced to embark?" "In that case," replied the captain, "as all cannot fit into it, it will be necessary to make a selection. Lots shall determine which of us are to go, and I shall not ask to be treated differently from the others." "We have not come to that, luckily," replied the boatswain. "The iceberg is solid, and there is no fear of its melting before winter." "No," assented West, "that is not to be feared. What it behoves us to do is, while watching the boat, to keep an eye on the provisions." "We are lucky," added her eagerly, "to have put our cargo in safety. Poor dear Halbrane, she will remain in these seas like the Jane, her elder sister." "Yes, without doubt, and I thought so for many reasons. The one destroyed by the savages of Tsalal, the other by one of these catastrophes that no human power can prevent." "You are right," replied the captain, "and we must prevent our men from plundering. We are sure of enough provisions for 1 year, without counting what we may get by fishing. And it is so much the more necessary, Captain, to keep a close watch, because I have seen some hovering about the spirit casks." "I will see to that," replied West. "But," I then asked, "had we not better prepare ourselves for the fact that we may be compelled to winter on this iceberg?" "May heaven avert such a terrible probability," replied the captain. "After all, if it were necessary, we could get through it, Mr. Georling," said the boatswain. "We could hollow out sheltering places in the ice, so as to be able to bear the extreme cold of the pole, and so long as we had sufficient to appease our hunger." At this moment the horrid recollection of the Grampus came to my mind, the scenes in which Dirk Peters killed Ned Holt, the brother of our sailing master. Should we ever be in such extremity? Would it not, before we proceed to set up winter quarters for 7 or 8 months, be better to leave the iceberg altogether, if such a thing were possible? I called the attention of Captain Len Guy and West to this point. This was a difficult question to answer, and a long silence preceded the reply. At last the captain said, "Yes, that would be the best resolution to come to, and if our boat could hold us all, with the provisions necessary for a voyage that might last 3 or 4 weeks, I would not hesitate to put to sea now and return towards the north." But I made them observe that we should be obliged to direct our course contrary to wind and current. Our schooner herself could hardly have succeeded in doing this, whilst to continue towards the south. "Towards the south," repeated the captain, who looked at me as though he sought to read my thoughts. "Why not?" I answered. "If the iceberg had not been stopped in its passage, perhaps it would have drifted to some land in that direction, and might not our boat accomplish what it would have done?" The captain, shaking his head, answered nothing. West also was silent. "Our iceberg will end by raising its anchor," replied Herr eagerly. "It does not hold to the bottom, like the Falklands or the Kerguelens, so the safest course is to wait, as the boat cannot carry 23, the number of our party." I dwelt upon the fact that it was not necessary for all 23 to embark. It would be sufficient, I said, for 5 or 6 of us to reconnoiter further south for 12 or 15 miles. "South," repeated Captain Len Guy. Undoubtedly, Captain, I added. You probably know what the geographers frankly admit, that the Antarctic regions are formed by a capped continent. Geographers know nothing, and can know nothing about it, replied West coldly. It is a pity, said I, that as we are so near, we should not attempt to solve this question of a polar continent. I thought it better not to insist just at present. Moreover, there would be danger in sending out our only boat on a voyage of discovery, as the current might carry it too far, or it might not find us again in the same place. And indeed, if the iceberg happened to get loose at the bottom, and to resume its interrupted drift, what would become of the men in the boat? The drawback was that the boat was too small to carry us all, with the necessary provisions. Now of the seniors, there remained 10 men, counting Dirk Peters. Of the new men there were 13, 23 in all. The largest number our boat could hold was from 11 to 12 persons. Then 11 of us, indicated by lot, would have to remain on this island of ice. And what would become of them? With regard to this, Hurley made a sound observation. After all, he said, I don't know that those who would embark would be better off than those who remained. I am so doubtful of the result, that I would willingly give up my place to anyone who wanted it. Perhaps the boatswain was right. But in my own mind, when I asked that the boat might be utilized, it was only for the purpose of reconnoitering the iceberg. We finally decided to arrange everything with a view to wintering out, even were our ice mountain again to drift. We may be sure that will be agreed to by our men, declared Hurley. What is necessary must be done, replied the mate, and today we must set to work. That was a sad day, on which we began our preparations. Endicott the cook was the only man who submitted without murmuring. As a Negro, who cares little about the future, shallow and frivolous like all his race, he resigned himself easily to his fate, and this is, perhaps, true philosophy. Besides, when it came to the question of cooking, it mattered very little to him whether it was here or there, so long as his stoves were set up somewhere. So he said to his friend the mate, with his broad Negro smile, Luckily my kitchen did not go off with the schooner, and you shall see, Hurley, if I do not make up dishes just as good as on board the Halbrane, so long as provisions don't grow scarce, of course. Well, they will not be wanting for some time to come, replied the boatswain. We need not fear hunger, but cold, such cold as would reduce you to an icicle the minute you cease to warm your feet, cold that makes your skin crack and your skull split. Even if we had some hundreds of tons of coal, but all things being well calculated, there is only just what will do to boil this large kettle. And that is sacred, cried Endicott. Touching is forbidden, the kitchen before all. And that is the reason why it never strikes you to pity yourself, you old nigger. You can always make sure of keeping your feet warm at your oven. What would you have, boatswain? You are a first-rate cook, or you are not. When you are, you take advantage of it, but I will remember to keep you a little place before my stove. That's good, Endicott. Each one shall have his turn. There is no privilege, even for a boatswain. On the whole, it is better not to have to fear famine. One can fight against the cold. We shall dig holes in the iceberg and cuddle ourselves up there. And why should we not have a general dwelling room? We could make a cave for ourselves with pickaxes. I have heard tell that ice preserves heat. Well, let it preserve ours, and that is all I ask of it. The hour had come for us to return to the camp, and to seek our sleeping places. Dirk Peters alone refused to be relieved of his duty as watchman of the boat, and nobody thought of disputing the post with him. Captain Len Guy and West did not enter the tents until they had made certain that Hearn and his companions had gone to their usual place of rest. I came back likewise and went to bed. I could not tell how long I had been sleeping, nor what time it was, when I found myself rolling on the ground after a violent shock. What could be happening? Was it another capsize of the iceberg? We were all up in a second, then outside the tents in the full light of a night in the polar regions. A second floating mass of enormous size had just struck our iceberg, which had hoisted the anchor, as the sailors say, and was drifting towards the south. An unhoped-for change in the situation had taken place. What were to be the consequences of our being no longer cast away at that place? The current was now carrying us in the direction of the pole. The first feeling of joy inspired by this conviction was, however, succeeded by all the terrors of the unknown. And what an unknown! Dirk Peters only was entirely rejoiced that we had resumed the route which, he believed, would lead us to the discovery of traces of his poor Pym. Far other ideas occupied the minds of his companions. Captain Len Guy no longer entertained any hope of rescuing his countrymen, and having reached the condition of despair, he was bound by his duty to take his crew back to the north, so as to clear the Antarctic Circle while the season rendered it possible to do so. And we were being carried away towards the south. Naturally enough, we were all deeply impressed by the fearfulness of our position, which may be summed up in a few words. We were no longer cast away with a possible ship, but the tenants of a floating iceberg, with no hope but that our monster tenement might encounter one of the whaling ships whose business in the deep waters lies between the Orkneys, New Georgia, and the Sandwich Islands. A quantity of things had been thrown into the ice by the collision which had set our iceberg afloat, but these were chiefly articles belonging to the Halbrane. Owing to the precaution that had been taken on the previous day, when the cargo was stowed away in the clefts, it had been only slightly damaged. What would have become of us had all our reserves been swallowed up in that grim encounter? Now the two icebergs formed but one, which was traveling south at the rate of 2 miles an hour. At this rate, 30 hours would suffice to bring us to the point of the axis at which the terrestrial meridians unite. Did the current which was carrying us along pass on to the pole itself, or was there any land which might arrest our progress? This was another question, and I discussed it with the boatswain. "Nobody knows, Mr. Georling," was Hurley-Gurley's reply. "If the current goes to the pole, we shall go there, and if it doesn't, we shan't. An iceberg isn't a ship, and as it has neither sails nor helm, it goes as the drift takes it." "That's true, boatswain, and therefore I had the idea that if 2 or 3 of us were to embark in the boat—" "Ah, you still hold to your notion of the boat?" "Certainly, for, if there is land somewhere, is it not possible that the people of the Jane have come upon it, Mr. Georling, at 4,000 miles from Sallel Island?" "Who knows, boatswain?" "That may be, but allow me to say that your argument will be reasonable when the land comes in sight, if it ever does so. Our captain will see what ought to be done, and he will remember that time presses. We cannot delay in these waters, and after all, the one thing of real importance to us is to get out of the polar circle before the winter makes it impassable." There was good sense in Hurley-Gurley's words. I could not deny the fact. During that day, the greater part of the cargo was placed in the interior of a vast cave-like fissure in the side of the iceberg, where, even in case of a second collision, casks and barrels would be in safety. Our men then assisted Endicott to set up his cooking stove between 2 blocks, so that it was firmly fixed, and they heaped up a great mass of coals close to it. No murmurs, no recrimination disturbed these labors. It was evident that silence was deliberately maintained. The crew obeyed the captain and West because they gave no orders, but such as were of urgent necessity. But afterwards, would these men allow the authority of their leaders to be uncontested? How long would the recruits from the Falklands, who were already exasperated by the disasters of our enterprise, resist their desire to seize upon the boat and escape? I did not think they would make the attempt, however, so long as our iceberg should continue to drift, for the boat could not outstrip its progress. But if it were to run aground once more, to strike upon the coast of an island or a continent, what would not these unfortunate creatures do to escape the horrors of wintering under such conditions? In the afternoon, during the hour of rest allowed to the crew, I had a second conversation with Dirk Peters. I had taken my customary seat at the top of the iceberg, and had occupied it for half an hour, being, as may be supposed, deep in thought, when I saw the half-breed coming quickly up the slope. We had exchanged hardly a dozen words since the iceberg had begun to move again. When Dirk Peters came up to me, he did not address me at first, and was so intent on his thoughts that I was not quite sure he saw me. At length, he leaned back against an ice block and spoke. "Mr. Georling," he said, "you remember, in your cabin in the Halbrane, I told you the affair of the Grampus." I remembered well. I told you that Parker's name was not Parker, that it was Holt, and that he was Ned Holt's brother. I was afraid, I got away from him. I was afraid, I got away from him. "I know, Dirk Peters," I replied, "but why do you refer to that sad story again?" "Why, Mr. Georling, have you never said anything about it to anybody?" "Not to anybody," I protested. "How could you suppose I should be so ill-advised, so imprudent, as to divulge your secret, a secret which ought never to pass our lips, a dead secret?" Dead, yes, dead. And yet understand me, it seems to me that, among the crew, something is known. I instantly recalled to mind what the boatswain had told me concerning a certain conversation, in which he had overheard Hearn prompting Martin Holt to ask the half-breed what were the circumstances of his brother's death on board the Grampus. Had a portion of the secret got out, or was this apprehension on the part of Dirk Peters purely imaginary? Explain yourself, I said. Understand me, Mr. Georling, I am a bad hand at explaining. Yes, yesterday, I have thought of nothing else since. Martin Holt took me aside, far from the others, and told me that he wished to speak to me. Of the Grampus. Of the Grampus, yes, and of his brother, Ned Holt. For the first time he uttered that name before me, and yet we have sailed together for nearly 3 months. The half-breed's voice was so changed that I could hardly hear him. It seemed to me, he resumed, that in Martin Holt's mind, no, I was not mistaken, there was something like a suspicion. But tell me what he said, tell me exactly what he asked you, what is it? I felt sure that the question put by Martin Holt, whatsoever its bearing, had been inspired by Hearn. Nevertheless, as I considered it well that the half-breed should know nothing of the sealing master's disquieting and inexplicable intervention in this tragic affair, I decided upon concealing it from him. He asked me, replied Dirk Peters, did I not remember Ned Holt of the Grampus, and whether he had perished in the fight with the mutineers or in the shipwreck, whether he was one of the men who had been abandoned with Captain Barnard. In short, he asked me if I could tell him how his brother died. Ah, how? No idea could be conveyed of the horror with which the half-breed uttered words, which revealed a profound loathing of himself. And what answer did you make to Martin Holt? None. You should have said that Ned Holt perished in the wreck of the brig. I could not, understand me, I could not. The two brothers are so like each other. In Martin Holt I seemed to see Ned Holt. I was afraid, I got away from him. The half-breed drew himself up with a sudden movement, and I sat thinking, leaning my head on my hands. These tardy questions of Holt's respecting his brother were put, I had no doubt whatsoever, at the instigation of Hearn, but what was his motive, and was it at the Falklands that he had discovered the secret of Dirk Peters? I had not breathed a word on the subject to anyone. To the second question, no answer suggested itself. The first involved a serious issue. Did the sealing master merely desire to gratify his enmity against Dirk Peters, the only one of the Falkland sailors who had always taken the side of Captain Len Guy, and who had prevented the seizure of the boat by Hearn and his companions? Did he hope, by arousing the wrath and vengeance of Martin Holt, to detach the sailing master from his allegiance, and induce him to become an accomplice in Hearn's own designs? And, in fact, when it was a question of sailing the boat in these seas, had he not imperative need of Martin Holt, one of the best seamen of the Halbrane, a man who would succeed where Hearn and his companions would fail if they had only themselves to depend on? I became lost in this labyrinth of hypotheses, and it must be admitted that its complications added largely to the troubles of an already complicated position. When I raised my eyes, Dirk Peters had disappeared. He had said what he came to say, and he now knew that I had not betrayed his confidence. The customary precautions were taken for the night, no individual being allowed to remain outside the camp, with the exception of the half-breed, who was in charge of the boat. The following day was the 31st of January. I pushed back the canvas of the tent, which I shared with Captain Len Guy and West respectively, as each succeeded the other on release from the alternate watch, very early, and experienced a severe disappointment. Mist everywhere, nay, more than mist, a thick yellow, mouldy-smelling fog, and more than this again, the temperature had fallen sensibly. This was probably a forewarning of the austral winter. The summit of our ice mountain was lost in vapor, in a fog which would not resolve itself into rain, but would continue to muffle up the horizon. Bad luck, said the boatswain, for now if we were to pass by land we should not perceive it. And our drift? More considerable than yesterday, Mr. Georling. The captain has sounded, and he makes the speed no less than between 3 and 4 miles. And what do you conclude from this? I conclude that we must be within a narrower sea, since the current is so strong. I should not be surprised if we had land on both sides of us within 10 or 15 miles. This, then, would be a wide strait that cuts the Antarctic continent. Yes, our captain is of that opinion. And, holding that opinion, is he not going to make an attempt to reach one or other of the coasts of the strait? And how? With the boat. Risk the boat in the midst of this fog, exclaimed the boatswain as he crossed his arms. What are you thinking of, Mr. Georling? Can we cast anchor to wait for it? And all the chances would be that we should never see it again. Ah, if we only had the halbrane. But there was no longer a halbrane. In spite of the difficulty of the ascent through the half-condensed vapor, I climbed up to the top of the iceberg. But when I had gained that eminence, I strove in vain to pierce the impenetrable gray mantle in which the waters were wrapped. I remained there, hustled by the northeast wind, which was beginning to blow freshly and might perhaps rend the fog asunder. But no, fresh vapors accumulated around our floating refuge, driven up by the immense ventilation of the open sea. Under the double action of the atmospheric and Antarctic currents, we drifted more and more rapidly, and I perceived a sort of shudder pass throughout the vast bulk of the iceberg. Then it was that I felt myself under the dominion of a sort of hallucination, one of those hallucinations which must have troubled the mind of Arthur Pym. It seemed to me that I was losing myself in his extraordinary personality. At last I was beholding all that he had seen. Was not that impenetrable mist the curtain of vapors which he had seen in his delirium? I peered into it, seeking for those luminous rays which had streaked the sky from east to west. I sought in its depths for that limitless cataract, rolling in silence from the height of some immense rampart lost in the vastness of the zenith. I sought for the awful white giant of the South Pole. At length reason resumed her sway. This visionary madness, intoxicating while it lasted, passed off by degrees, and I descended the slope to our camp. The whole day passed without a change. The fog never once lifted to give us a glimpse outside of its muffling folds, and if the iceberg, which had traveled 40 miles since the previous day, had passed by the extremity of the axis of the earth, we should never know it. Chapter 21. Amid the mists. So this was the sum of all our efforts, trials, and disappointments. Not to speak of the destruction of the halbrane, the expedition had already cost 9 lives. From 32 men who had embarked on the schooner, our number was reduced to 23. How low was that figure yet to fall? Between the South Pole and Antarctic Circle lay 20 degrees, and those would have to be cleared in a month or 6 weeks at the most. If not, the iceberg barrier would be reformed and closed up. As for wintering in that part of the Antarctic Circle, not a man of us could have survived it. Besides, we had lost all hope of rescuing the survivors of the Jane, and the sole desire of the crew was to escape as quickly as possible from the awful solitudes of the south. Our drift, which had been south down to the pole, was now north, and if that direction should continue, perhaps we might be favored with such good fortune as would make up for all the evil that had befallen us. In any case, there was nothing for it but, in familiar phrase, to let ourselves go. The mist did not lift during the 2nd, 3rd, and of February, and it would have been difficult to make out the rate of progress of our iceberg since it had passed the pole. Captain Len Guy, however, and West considered themselves safe in reckoning it at 250 miles. The current did not seem to have diminished in speed or changed its course. It was now beyond a doubt that we were moving between the two halves of a continent, one on the east, the other on the west, which formed the vast Antarctic region. And I thought it was a matter of great regret that we could not get aground on one or the other side of this vast strait, whose surface would presently be solidified by the coming of winter. When I expressed this sentiment to Captain Len Guy, he made me the only logical answer. What would you have, Mr. Georling? We are powerless. There is nothing to be done, and the persistent fog is the worst part of our ill luck. I no longer know where we are. It is impossible to take an observation, and this befalls us just as the sun is about to disappear for long months. Let me come back to the question of the boat, said I, for the last time. Could we not, with the boat,